Now, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, 4Air. 4Air is leading the way with the industry's first framework to address aviation's climate impact, offering clear, verifiable pathways to reduce and counteract aircraft emissions. Their new Assure SAF registry is making it easier than ever to manage and claim sustainable aviation fuel usage across the value chain. Want to learn more? Check out the show notes.
It's not the point that you reach 2050. The question is, how big is the area under the curve? If you go like this and just only at the end you start to come down again, the total amount of emissions between now and 2050 is gigantic. The earlier you are in terms of bringing the lines down, the lower the area under the curve, as it's called, the lower the total CO2 emissions. And CO2 emissions are not just a flow issue, they are a stock issue. It's the bathtub that we are filling.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Dick Benschop. Dick is the chair of the Mission Possible Partnership. The Mission Possible Partnership is leading efforts to structurally embed demand for low-carbon commodities and accelerate the green industrial transition. If that sounds like a mouthful, it is a major initiative. Cross parties, lots of governments, lots of technology companies, lots of large companies like the Royal Schiphol Group, for example, are part of the Mission Possible Partnership. What's interesting is Dick is also the former CEO of the Royal Schiphol Group, which ran the Amsterdam airport, and Dick was one of the proponents of demand reduction at Schiphol. Dick and I speak about what is needed to make aviation net zero, and do we need to take this hard pill, swallow the bitter pill of demand reduction, for example. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Dick, it is a pleasure to be speaking with you on the podcast after meeting with you in person, on stage and off stage at conferences as the chair of the board at Mission Possible Partnership. Can you tell us about what is MPP and what is it that you're trying to do?
Yes, thank you very much. And great for having me. And I'm a big fan of what you're doing. So very happy to participate in your podcast and what you're trying to achieve in terms of bringing out what is happening and to more people than those who are just at the conferences, indeed. And that's extremely important because I will get to that at some point in time. In aviation, that's one of the sectors where as an individual traveler, you have the chance to participate. And that's a very interesting aspect. Mission Possible, I'm the chair of the board. It's a partnership between think tanks and companies. It's an NGO. And what we are trying to do is, after the progress you can see in building solar power and wind power and renewable electricity, to look at what is called the harder-to-abate sectors. Because we don't just have to do electricity. That's just a part of the energy system. We have to make green steel, green fuels for aviation and shipping, aluminium, cement, chemicals, those sectors. And we are a collaboration with philanthropic support who wants to give support to first projects, first-of-a-kind projects, get them off the ground, and more towards the scaling of those projects. We had a focus on the US. We did a lot there on Europe, but we are branching out because there's global developments in the global south, countries like Brazil. We have activities in the MENA region. What we do is to try to give support as much as possible, talk to governments as well, And we do keep a track. We have a global project tracker. Very interesting. It was very helpful for a lot of people to see what's actually happening, not just a project in operation that's just starting, but also who are working towards final investment decision, what projects have been announced. So that's the type of work we do, and we do that in a way that we want to be as business relevant and as practical as possible. That's us.
Right. It was indeed the project tracker that I first learned of you, which I believe was the SAF project tracker, and how many SAF projects are going on around the world. That was very impressive. I think there were 30 plus projects going on and we need 300 to go.
Yeah, and there's around, I think we are around 60 SAF projects at the stage of really getting to investment decision or operational. But we need much more. And that's on a 2030 basis. So that's just a start on our way to net zero in 2050. And we have made sector transition strategies. We do have the project tracker, so that can help everybody. And then we have to have targeted areas where we try to give support and get things off the ground, and help governments as well, because we need this type of collaboration, industry, governments, everything. It's huge, so everything needs to work like clockwork: technology, investments, policies, customers. And we know, of course, that it's not working like clockwork, and we have to improve that. And now that's where we spend our time on, and I'm a volunteer there.
Okay, you mentioned you're working across hard to decarbonize sectors. What makes aviation particularly challenging compared to other sectors, let's say shipping?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And depending a bit on the mood I'm in, I answer that it's not that different, or that, yes, it is quite challenging. And both of it is true. What makes it challenging, I guess, is the level of growth we see in aviation, and the fact that we are only at the beginning of decarbonizing aviation. The growth in aviation worldwide is, apart from the COVID years, of course, was like 2 times the level of economic growth. So that's massive. And if you look at the number of people worldwide who have not been flying yet, and who are eager to get the experience and join the ranks of people who have been flying, that's enormous. So the scale of the issue. And then the level of investment you need to get to the sustainable aviation fuels, the level of investment you need if you want to go electric flying or hydrogen flying, where we can talk about. And that scale and that level put against the time that we have. Because you can describe what we are doing as a race to achieve scale, and it's a race against time. And just the figures for 2030, how much we have to do, the level of investment, the number of plants that still have to be built in order to get to 2030, which is then just the first 2 steps on the staircase towards net zero.
Right. So you mentioned the number of plants that are to be built. Currently, we are at, I think, 30 SAF plants, or 33 SAF plants on a drawing board. This needs to be scaled up 5 to 6 times by 2030. How are we going to get there?
There's a mix of measures needed. And it was a very interesting study, not just for aviation, but for sustainability overall. Recently, it was the Potsdam Institute, by the way, for those who are interested, which looked back and say, what interventions have been successful? Where did we see, like in solar energy or in offshore wind, what made that happen? And if you then look at the policy aspect of it, then it was that you need a mix of policy measures. You need the technology, of course, but that's available in even for steel, but also for aviation and for shipping. We know how to make sustainable aviation fuel. And yes, it needs still to innovate and become cheaper at scale, but it's there. But how to promote it, how to piece it together, how to get that clockwork going. There's an element of pricing involved. Because it's more expensive, and carbon and pollution has to be priced, and that will help the green developments. Secondly, what you need as well is especially at the beginning, is a bit of government subsidy and support. And that's done very differently in various parts of the world, which leads then to all kind of issues as well. But in the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, a big push. In Europe, there's some support schemes available as well. Chinese government, strategic push, of course. And the third element is regulation. And that's what helped in Europe, especially because there's now what you call a blending mandate in place. And it's almost 2025. And then next year, every flight starting in the European Union will have to have 2% of sustainable aviation fuel blended into the fuel mix. And we've seen that in road transport before, and we're doing now in aviation. And what it does is that it solves this chicken and egg issue. And when I was at Schiphol as CEO and going around and talking to airlines and talking to energy companies, and I have a background in energy as well, I found this chicken and egg issue. The energy companies would say, the demand is not there. We cannot rely on it. We cannot do such a big investment because the demand is not there. The airlines would say, well, yes, we would love to fly on SAF and to get started, but there's no SAF available on the market. The supply is not there. So chicken and egg. And there's all kinds of voluntary ways and getting parties together. But the mandate is extremely effective in order to solve a chicken and egg issue. Just to get
the mandate will get airlines to fly today.
Yes, and what you then saw is that in anticipation of the mandate, airlines have started to use SAF, one more than the other, but it's happening. Big companies who want to address their aviation footprint, the customers of the airlines, the Microsofts of this world, the KPMGs, they start to think, okay, can we buy SAF already as well? And can you start to offer that to us? Or they start to contract SAF, or there's a voluntary market building. And the beauty is that, and that's the aspect where we can all get involved. Many airlines now offer you and I the possibility, if you book a flight, to book sustainable aviation fuel as well. A few years ago, the airline I use most is KLM, of course, the Dutch airline. You could buy a tree offsetting, but now you can buy SAF. You can buy a little bit for this amount of money, a bit more, or you can do your whole flight. That's rather expensive still, but we can all chip in now, and we can all start to help. And that's important because for many people, your footprint and the aviation footprint is very visible. You know now that if you fly, that you contribute to global warming, and that's a dilemma for many people. So you can get started to help to solve your own dilemma as well. So and that's for aviation. That's a bit of the benefit of the outsized attention almost. That's a sector that's under the spotlight, and then the answer is not, no, it's only 2 to 3%. The answer is, okay, we'll accept the spotlight and we make use of it. So we'll get people on board. We'll get voluntary demand. We'll try to make changes as fast as possible. That's the way to go.
So you do believe that mandates are the catalyst. One interesting catalyst you have in one of your transition strategy was high oil prices that ultimately drove major leaps in aircraft efficiency a couple of decades ago, with SAF costing 2 to 5 times more than conventional jet fuel. Do you think this price pressure could drive another wave of innovation in aviation?
Yeah, it will help, and of course there are ups and downs in the efficiency, but there is still again and again new generations of aircraft, and when they get into the fleets of the airlines, you see that the emissions and the efficiency, emissions go down and the efficiency goes up, and that the economics of just the fuel cost, it's about 40% of a flight is the fuel cost. And if your fuel then even gets a bit more expensive, if you start to add sustainable aviation fuel, exactly, that is working. And you need that. You need demand measures as well, because we have inefficient airspace use. That's such a loss. Only in Europe, you could save the first 10% of CO2 emissions by reorganizing the airspace. And that's a political act. Very strange that we're not able to do that with everything politicians and politics says about sustainability and aviation. And there are high-speed trains opportunities. We should promote collaboration between airlines and high-speed train operators, because more efficient way on those destinations, etc., etc. But then still, you will have a massive amount of air transport and necessary air transport, and that's where the fuel comes in, and the push for the fuel. But it's a combination. It's efficiency, it's demand, and it's substitution, new fuels. And at some point in time is the necessary innovation. Not for all flights. Not the further you go, the more difficult it is. But there will be a market for battery electric flights. There will probably be a market for hydrogen flights as well. And then you see the combination in the future, that shorter range, you will see electric planes, then hydrogen for the mid-range, and the long range will, in my view, still be sustainable aviation fuel.
Right. I want to bring to fore a recent discussion that took place at COP29 between the IMF proposing a carbon tax on aviation and shipping. And shipping's response was, yes, we welcome something like this. And aviation's response, IATA specifically, was no, you know what, it's the fossil fuel subsidies that are at play here. Please don't tell us to bring in any carbon pricing or taxing. Where do you think carbon pricing or carbon taxes can play a role in accelerating aviation's transition?
Yes, because the price difference between the green version and the fossil version plays a role, of course. And the margins in aviation are not that high, so that makes airlines always quite anxious about any cost increase. If you see the pressure on airlines, on cost, on efficiency, that absolutely plays a role. But first of all, and in my mix of policy measures, carbon taxation plays a role. In Europe, it's the emission trading system. It can be different forms of carbon taxes. What is different is a tax on flying as such, on the activity, which would not be related to carbon. Because if you have a tax on carbon, you start to use sustainable aviation fuel. For that part of that fuel, you don't have to pay the carbon tax because you have the sustainable fuel. So you can avoid the carbon tax by becoming greener. The aviation tax you cannot avoid. And the effect of that should be more expensive. We fly less. I doubt it. But you can also, instead of taxation, in that sense, you can look at why not mandate a bit more aviation fuel? The price of flying will go up a bit. Well, it would have the same effect as a tax in terms of, let's say you add $20 to a flight or $50 to a flight. But using SAF on that flight is greening and reducing the CO2 emissions. Just inning the tax and putting it into the government coffers is not helping. So pricing has to play a role, but not all taxation is as smart as people suggest.
Well, I think this is a good time to segue a little into your past role, where you used to lead Amsterdam Schiphol Airport and were one of the most vocal advocates of capacity growth at large hubs like Amsterdam. Do you still hold that belief? Do you think capping capacity at large airports like Schiphol is a tool that aviation will use?
Well, there's always two issues for aviation. You have the global footprint, and there I was a fierce advocate, of course, of introducing sustainable aviation fuel. I lobbied for the European blending mandate in that role, not in my NGO role now, but in my role as CEO of the airport, together with others. And that was successful, and we see the benefits of that now starting to happen. But you also have the local circumstances and the local footprint in terms of noise and in terms of emissions. You have to be very mindful, especially in the context we are in the Netherlands, which is densely populated, that we have a rather large hub, almost outsized airport for the scale of the Netherlands. That brings benefits, but it brings risks as well. So I was always very mindful that that if we talked about growth for the airport, that it could not be unrestricted growth, not just give way to the sector, and that if there was a way forward where you could do more, that it would have to be within a declining footprint. And I'm still hoping, and I've been working on it. It's not there yet, but the government has said that they will do it. That they will define 2 lines for the development of capacity at the airport of Schiphol. One is a line which is declining in terms of the amount of noise that is being emitted, and the other line is the line of CO2 emission that has to go down as well. And if you put those environmental constraints, then capacity as such is not the issue anymore. And then the sector can innovate itself and become more efficient and use more SAF and have quieter planes in order to earn its place and potentially growth in the number of flights. But that is then within a context of a reduction of the footprint, both global and local. And I think it's, again, it's a balance, and it's also about a bit of smart policy making, and not just put a number somewhere, not put a tax somewhere. Think about what you're doing. What is the most effective way of pushing ourselves in the direction that we need to go?
This is so interesting. You, of course, face very significant opposition from KLM, the main airline there at Schiphol, as well as in general, airlines tend to be against any sort of caps on growth. How do we solve this tussle? There's no clear answer here.
In my view, by designing smart and effective environmental limits, and then the discussion is about how steep is the line coming down. And if the line has been established, less noise, less CO2, and you can earn your place, and you can earn your rights within those conditions and within those boundaries, then I think you start to stimulate the right behavior. But as I say, because of the visibility of aviation, and sometimes the policy debate is relatively simple on all sides, pro-tax, contra-tax, limitations, no limitations. But I would argue for the design of effective environmental constraints, which leave room for economic activity.
I think I got to have Marianne from KLM back on the podcast to discuss her response to your recommendation.
My relationship with the airline and the airlines was always very good. We always had discussions, of course, but they understood what I was trying to achieve.
Absolutely. No, thank you for the segue there. Looking at emerging technologies in the future, your research suggests that hydrogen and battery electric aircraft could supply up to a third of final energy demand for aviation by 2050. This is the most optimistic scenario I have seen for hydrogen and battery electric. Is this realistic?
Yeah, to be seen. There are solutions behind it. What helps, of course, if you take battery electric flying, and you don't go from Amsterdam to Tokyo in an electric plane. That's not the perspective. But within Europe, 1-2 hours, 500 plus kilometers, even new markets there, which are now not currently being served. And we have to take a car to get from Stuttgart to Bordeaux, for example. Those type of connections, what helps with the development of electric flying is the fact that the developments in battery technology are not dependent upon aviation. They are driven by big improvements, big developments in battery technology, passenger vehicles, trucks, energy storage. The focus on batteries is gigantic. And there's a curve in batteries, of course, to become better. And there's a lot of research going into alternatives in batteries and to get to more efficient batteries and to get to longer storage, and therefore the density increases, the weight, which is the killer for aviation, the weight of batteries compared to the energy content comes down, all of that. So that's not dependent upon aviation. That is happening anyway, and that will help aviation. And you see X number of players now developing battery electric flying. And that is at the stage that it's beyond the drawing board. Its first flights are happening, and we can go to a period of scaling. And it will be planes. You've seen that in passenger cars as well, which have lower operational costs. You can create different business models. You can have a 20-seater, a 60-seater, which is very interestingly to operate at relatively low cost. And the type of services that type of plane can do, and then you will go up. But beyond that, if you talk, you have the hydrogen. It will bring you further. It's needs a bit more development. I think by 2030 you will see a raft of electric planes in operation. Hydrogen is 2035 plus. But also there's a whole ecosystem developing on startups, dedicated players like ZeroAvia, but also the big ones. Airbus is investing heavily in a 160-seater, and they still have choices to be made in terms of exactly is it the fuel cell? Are we going to burn hydrogen? Is it a combination? How are we exactly going to do that? But they are committed and still committed to develop that plane. And if you then look at it, the amount of initiatives, the credible companies behind it, there is something happening there.
Right. It's very, very interesting. You mentioned you'll see a slew of electric aircraft in operation by 2030. I do hope that comes through. I'm quite hopeful for Heart Aerospace. I'm looking at Electra for regional electric flying. I think there are some, or the aviation Alice, Beta Technologies. There are quite a few that are making some good progress.
Electric.
Right, electric. Yeah. That's correct. By 2050, SAF could represent up to 10% of global electricity demand. How do we ensure that this massive scaling doesn't compete with other sectors' decarbonization efforts?
Yeah, that is, let's say, in our scenarios and strategies where you refer to is kind of the honesty element. If you for a sector, if you draw a perspective of how you can decarbonize, you have to look at two aspects. One aspect is how fast do you go? Because it's not the point that you reach 2050. The question is, how big is the area under the curve? If you go like this and just only at the end you start to come down again, the total amount of emissions between now and 2050 is gigantic. The earlier you are in terms of bringing the lines down, the lower the area under the curve, as it's called, the lower the total CO2 emissions. And CO2 emissions are not just a flow issue, they are a stock issue. It's the bathtub that we are filling, and etc. So that's important, and we have incorporated that in our sector strategies, and that differentiates scenarios as well. And the other one is, of course, fine, your sector, but we have shipping, we have passenger trucks, we have steel, we have all those other sectors that need hydrogen, that need green electricity. How is that going to add up? And that's why we have calculated what the share then of aviation of total demand could be. And there will be a tension there. That will depend on how fast other sectors can go. And we have to find that out. And therefore, we have to keep on innovating and becoming more efficient while applying sustainable aviation fuel and working on hydrogen and battery electric. It's absolutely clear that we have to do that. But it's not completely impossible either. If you would have said half of the world's electricity, but 10% for this sector. In the meantime, there are other discussions to be had around biomass availability. Where is biomass going to go? Well, if you now look at how fast passenger cars can electrify, and you see how much biofuels are still used for passenger cars, you can foresee a shift. As you say, okay, at some point in time, you just say passenger cars, that's electric. and we just replace fossil fuels, and the bio and the biomass we can use elsewhere in industry where we need it, or in aviation or in shipping. And that's the type of discussions that we need to have, because in the end, it's the one thing I said, apart from scale and time and smart policies and the clockwork, a system perspective as well. And that's where you get in those kind of trade-offs. And you have to be transparent there in terms of, you can't just solve one sector without realizing whether it's in a context. Can it help other sectors? Can it pull upon other sectors? And that's why I like it, at least for our stuff we do as just one NGO, that we look at various sectors at the same time.
That's I think the most interesting part here. You're looking at multiple sectors, you're looking at multiple stakeholders. How do you break free from this siloed thinking? How are you fostering meaningful collaboration between aviation stakeholders, policymakers, and even financial institutions?
Yeah. One of the things we try to do, of course, is bring parties together. On the supply side, the companies that have to build the green steel plant or the hydrogen plant. Before that, local government policy making, but also looking at the demand side and how to activate the demand side. That is what we try to do indeed. And one of the things we can do and we hope to do, and where we are able to do it, and that's not always the case, but where we do it is that we bring the experience of one sector into the other. And it's as you say, I'm almost flabbergasted how siloed we still are. If I talk to people in ammonia production, and I talk about the idea, how can we promote green fertilizer? Yes, but the farmers and this and the cost and etc. And then I say, have you heard what we did in aviation with the blending mandate? No, not really heard of. Another sector, other set of stakeholders. And then, so we have now started the debate, at least, and the discussion. Would it help hydrogen, green hydrogen into ammonia, green ammonia, by having a green fertilizer mandate to start with, in order to get going in that market as well? And if we do that in fertilizer and we produce green ammonia, that might become available for shipping as well. And then suddenly we are working on something that has a benefit in more sectors. And we took the learning on how to solve the chicken and egg problem in aviation, although still at the beginning, of course, but how we try to solve it at least. And that's fascinating, what you can do there.
Do you see, now that you're working with a nonprofit as opposed to your days leading Schiphol Airport, do you see these silos breaking down and people being more open to collaborating, or do you see, defenses going up?
Well, I think we take broader and broader views now. And what I said about it's a system issue, when we have to look at system issues and the mix of policies, I think more and more people will talk about it. It's not just we have to get renewable electricity and we subsidize it because we need more than electricity and we need more than subsidies. People start to realize that, and you now see with the enormous progress we make on wind and solar, that you get to system issues as well. Where's the infrastructure? Where's the conversion into hydrogen? Where's energy storage? Because we are wasting already in certain parts of the world solar and wind energy, because the infrastructure is not able to cope with it, or the long duration storage is not available. And then you see, okay, so those type of relationships in a system are better and better understood, and that's highly necessary as well. The one, and that's an interesting one, we talked about expenses, and it's costly. That's the one thing I think we do not really understand yet completely, and we have to start to understand in order to solve the issue. If you produce sustainable aviation fuel, 2 to 3 times as expensive if you take the biofuel as existing jet fuel. If you produce green steel, what is it? 50 to 70% more expensive. Ammonia, green ammonia, same. Huge investment decisions, billions of dollars in new factories. How can we be sure that we can get that recovered? But the green steel ends up in a product. If the product is a car, and that's by now starting to get to a quite famous example, it's probably 400 or 500 euros or dollars on the cost of a car. 100% green steel and aluminium in that car. The green fertilizer I talked about, that you can put that into barley, into beer. The price of green fertilizer for a bottle of beer is less than 1/10 of a cent. Even sustainable aviation fuel, which is rather expensive, we're not talking about 100%. So we should be very careful with saying it's 2 to 3 times more expensive, because next year in the European Union we blend 2%, and that's leading. 2%. That's a few euros on a ticket in the European Union, where ticket prices vary wildly, as you know, and have gone up considerably post-COVID. The 2% is almost in the noise of the ticket price. Of course, if you would have 100% next year, but we are not living in that world of luxury, because we need all those soft plants we don't have yet. So we are talking about tiny percentages, or percentages to start with, to get going. And that's affordable again. And if we get going, and all those industrial developments have an S-curve where they go, first projects, you start to scale, and then at a certain point in time, you're beyond your tipping point, and it becomes more affordable, like we have seen in solar, like we have seen in wind, offshore wind. Then it becomes it becomes less expensive as well. So we have to look at this value chain, not just at the production side, we have to look at the consumer side as well. And that's my underpinning for those mandates as well, because it's not that you are hyping inflation, social problems because of the cost you're going to incur. That's not really happening. It dampens out. It percolates through the value chain to a very affordable, tiny extra cost at the end product level. So we have a bit of a coordination problem, not just an affordability problem. Because how can we make sure that this demand, if you talk about the green fertilizer, that Carlsberg or Heineken, that they commit to green fertilizer in a way that would allow Yara to take an investment decision on a green ammonia plant. But then you have to have certainty of demand, which is, in technical terms, which is bankable for the upstream, for the production decision at the beginning. Now, that's the thing, also talking about systems that we are starting to try to understand now. And that's why the demand side and activating that is so important. And what can we do there? Also governments. If you think about cement, that's twice aviation in terms of the CO2 emissions worldwide. I think about half of all the cement produced in the world is subject to local or national government decisions to buy, to build houses, to build infrastructure, public procurement. So governments can go a long way themselves if in their own purchasing they would start to introduce, okay, we start with 1%, 2%, 5%, for the cement companies to be able to trust that if they start to produce CO2-free cement, which is not that easy, you need to do a few things, and it has a cost indeed for those companies and the investments, but that you can recoup that because the demand will be there. And that's where we are now.
It is such a complex system. So many moving parts.
Absolutely. And but in the end, there's a few things to remember.
Yes, absolutely. If you look forward to 2030, what do you feel are the most critical milestones that aviation needs to achieve to stay on track for 2030? And are you actually confident that these can be achieved?
Yeah, we have started, and in different ways. So the mandate in Europe American airlines have committed. You see initiatives elsewhere in the world as well. So we have started. So the big question is, how fast do we scale? Because we need to scale because of the problem, and we need to scale in order to get a cheaper sustainable aviation fuel as well. That's the name of the game. I think there's a couple of issues in between the energy sector and the airlines around contracting sustainable aviation fuel and how to do that. That still have to be resolved. If you contract sustainable aviation fuel, you buy two things as an airline. You don't just buy fuel, but you buy what is called the properties of the fuel, the green
attributes
of it, the attributes, the certificates associated with the attributes, and we have to make arrangements for that. And there has to be another commercial mechanism, which is a book and claim system, that you can buy the attribute also as a customer for your flight, but it's not always very practical to have that exact amount of sustainable aviation fuel in the plane you are flying. So it has to be in the system and it has to be used. But you can disconnect the physical and the commercial reality of the attribute of the sustainable aviation fuel. And those kind of developments, also commercial innovation or arrangements, they have to be done very carefully and very transparent and very trustworthy, are totally important to get again beyond the first steps, because Microsoft is buying sustainable aviation fuel. But will it get the certificates which allows it to deduct it from its Scope 3 emissions? For the first 2%, they don't mind. But if they are going to buy 10, 20, 30, 40% and invest millions in terms of purchasing sustainable aviation fuel, they want to have their footprint reduced because that is acknowledged. And those and there's still some way to go. So next to the obvious issue, will the Nestes, the LanzaJets, the Shells and the BPs of this world invest fast enough? And are they able to invest fast enough to get those plants up and running? Is there still also in the way we do it, in the commercial arrangements, stuff to do? Because if we don't do that right, both on the not building the plants and not getting the arrangements in place, then we get to this. Okay, we all do a bit. We all do our first contract. We all do a 1%. We all do 2%. We all spend a few millions. But that's not going to solve the problem. We have to grow. We have to move beyond that, and therefore stuff has to be in place, and we have to make sure that we get it in place.
Wow, this actually fills me with hope rather than dread here. Now, the final part of this interview, Dick, is where we get to know you a bit more personally. Oh. And I'll ask you simple questions. For example, what's your favorite book? You've got lots behind you.
Those are my travel books. I love to travel. I must admit.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it's a bit who you, which version of myself you ask. There's some stuff you read at a young age, which has a big impact. For me, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, was the books when I was a student. I loved and was amazing. But later there was just to give it a Dutch twist, Harry Mulisch, a Dutch writer. He wrote a fascinating book, The Discovery of Heaven, and it's been translated in English as well. So my later version of myself would say Mulisch, and my younger version would say Tolkien.
Very interesting. Favorite movie?
Oh, a bit like that as well. I used to be as a youngster. You're quite. I was taken by Italian films. And we go a while back. But for example, you might have never heard of it, but the Death in Venice. by Luigi Visconti, one of the Italian masters, and also for the music. It's a very emotional experience, that film. There's Mahler in there, and I'm a fan of Mahler as well. So the combination of an Italian filmmaker and Mahler, Death in Venice, and after a great novel as well. But on a much lighter side, yes, A Fish Called Wanda. I've seen that now 5 times or something like that with the kids every time. The film about Asia, what is it? Crazy Rich Asians.
Oh, yes.
I lived in Kuala Lumpur, and the family, we lived in Kuala Lumpur for 4 years. So it's extremely recognizable. It plays in Singapore, but it's filmed mostly in Kuala Lumpur as well. So we know some of the places as well. So it's a much lighter version then again. I've become lighter, I guess, over time.
Glad to hear. Favorite city?
Rome.
Okay.
I was
Lots of
there.
history.
I was there this year. And my daughter was running a marathon, and my wife and I, with 2 other kids, we were running the relay marathon. So I did 10K. I did 10K in Rome, and I was in Rome again. And I've been there much more, of course. But it's always strikes you as such a beautiful city.
Very nice. What is it that you do in your free time?
Apart from doing podcasts. My big thing I like in life is having dinner with friends and family, and I spend time on it, and we go out and we cook and we do just being together. That's a big one. But I do sports as well, and golf, for example, and running. That's where I spend time on. And I do a few volunteer activities as well.
Okay, what is something you'd like to learn?
I'm thinking about it as for the next years, sailing. We've been on trips in the Mediterranean on nice catamarans with families, and then just going around and sailing around Mallorca and the Turkish coast and stuff like that. It's fascinating, but I wanted to do that myself, you need to have, a certificate again. Hey, you need to be qualified, and I'm not. So I always need a skipper. So I'm thinking about learning to sail.
Wow, amazing! I love it. What is the best advice you've received?
There's 2, if I may. The first one, and the first one is so obvious, but it was when I joined Shell. You get into a big company, and that's a learning environment, and I loved it. And the most important thing I learned at first was to know yourself, in the sense that what is your default, as you can call it, if you're under pressure, if you're too late, if there's no time, how do you act? How do you behave? What do you do? And I was always going after the goals, getting there, getting things done. Where you have to look at people as well and do other stuff. I really learned that. And recently, I wish I could have come up with it myself, but I read it somewhere, and it is so true and so beautiful. It says, if you quarrel with your partner, do it not to win, but to learn from each other.
Ooh.
I love that one.
Okay. All right. Advice noted.
Definitely done.
It's a pleasure speaking. Thank you very much for being very open, sharing your thoughts, not just of the future of aviation, but your past work that you have led with bravado when you were at Schiphol as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shashank. Thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simplifying, that's simply with an I.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimain is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.